The Taken at Gordon Manor, Episode 8, The Wedding. The chapel was cold, despite the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows, and Celestina clutched her father's arm as they began their slow walk down the aisle, her gloved hand trembling against the dark fabric of his coat. The air was heavy with the scent of lilies, their sweetness almost cloying in the small space. It had all happened so quickly that Celestina could barely comprehend it. The banns, that hasty tradition of announcing a marriage, had been rushed through in a matter of days rather than the customary 3 weeks. Though Georgie still lived, she was unresponsive, her once vibrant presence reduced to a motionless figure confined to her chair. The physician had been clear about her condition, being precarious, and whispers in the household suggested she might not last through the week. The wedding, meant to be a joyous occasion, felt more like a somber duty. There were perhaps a dozen people in attendance, a few nobles who could not be avoided without causing offence, Ruth and Timothy, the Reverend, and the servants who had been pressed into service as witnesses. Her father had been insistent that the ceremony remain small and quiet. "We cannot afford any more scandal," he had said that morning as she dressed. "This will be done properly but discreetly." As Celestina passed her mother's pew, her breath caught in her throat. There Georgie sat, propped upright by cushions, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as though she were merely resting. Her face was pale, her lips thin and bloodless, her eyes vacant and unseeing in a way that made Celestina's stomach turn. For a moment she thought she saw movement, her mother's head tilting ever so slightly to follow her down the aisle. But what came next froze her in place and made her knees threaten to give way. Georgie's face warped before her eyes. Her vacant gaze stretched into cavernous black pits where her eyes had been, and her skin grew ashen, the texture smooth and unnatural like polished stone. Her mouth shrank to a thin, inhuman slit, unmoving, but exuding an aura of menace that made the air feel thick and hard to breathe. Celestina's mind was pulled back into a memory buried so deep within her that she had forgotten it existed. She was 7 years old again, her small feet padding across the wooden floor of the east wing in the dead of night. Her mother's room was ahead, the door slightly ajar, and she could see the flickering of a blue light dancing along the walls and illuminating the darkened hall. Outside, a storm battered the windows with rain and wind, but the light was not of the lightning. It moved with intent, drifting along the window panes as though it were following her as she ran down the corridor. "Mother!" she had cried, her voice high and desperate with a child's fear. The bedchamber was eerily still when she reached it, the fire reduced to embers that barely glowed in the hearth. Georgie lay sleeping in her bed, her face serene and peaceful, as if untouched by the chaos outside or the strange light that filled the room. Celestina rushed toward her, wanting nothing more than to climb into bed beside her mother and hide from whatever was making that terrible blue glow. But before she could reach the bed, something stepped into her path and blocked her way. The figure was tall and thin, its silhouette barely human in the dim light. Its skin was pale and sickly grey, the smooth surface almost luminescent against the darkness of the room. Its eyes were vast and black, reflecting her terrified expression back at her like twin mirrors that seemed to see into her very soul. She stopped short, frozen in place as the creature bent toward her, its head tilting in an unnatural arc that no human neck could achieve. "Celestina." Her father's voice jolted her back to the present with such force that she nearly stumbled. She blinked rapidly, the memory receding like a wave pulling back from the shore, and her gaze darted back to her mother. Georgie was as she had been a moment before, still and silent, her face blank, her eyes vacant but human once more. "I'm fine," Celestina whispered to Dickie, though her voice was tight and unconvincing even to her own ears. He slowed his pace slightly, his brow furrowed with concern as he looked down at her. "I know this is hard for you," he murmured in a voice low enough that only she could hear. "Your mother only wanted this for you." We must comply with her wishes before it's too late." Celestina gave a faint nod, unable to speak further for fear that her voice would break entirely. She clung to his arm and allowed him to guide her down the remaining length of the aisle, toward where Manchester stood waiting. Manchester's hands were clasped before him, his face an unreadable mask of composure. But Celestina could hear him as clearly as if he were speaking aloud, his thoughts echoing in her mind in a way that made her skin prickle with unease. "She looks beautiful. God, I hope I don't make a mess of this." A flicker of emotion crossed his face that matched the nervousness in his thoughts. What if I can't protect her? What if I make things worse? Then his thoughts shifted, becoming something else entirely, something that made Celestina's stomach turn. Tonight. Finally tonight. Her skin. The way she'll look without. The thought cut off abruptly as though he had caught himself, and his expression tightened with what might have been shame or guilt. No, don't think about that now. She's terrified. I can see it in her eyes. I need to be patient. But then, unbidden, another thought slipped through. But she's my wife now, she'll have to. Celestina felt her jaw clench as she listened to the war happening inside his mind. Part of him genuinely seemed to care about her fear, but another part was already imagining things she didn't want him imagining, claiming rights she didn't want him to have. She stared at him as she walked, her steps steady now, but her mind recoiling from what she was hearing. Can he hear me the way I hear him? She wondered, a flicker of panic rising within her at the thought of him knowing her every thought. She tested it carefully, thinking as clearly and deliberately as she could manage. I hate you. I hate what you're thinking about me. Manchester gave no reaction whatsoever, his expression remaining composed and solemn, though his eyes briefly flicked to hers with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat before he looked away again. Focus. The vows. Don't ruin this for her. She exhaled quietly with a mixture of relief and disgust. No, he can't hear me the way I hear him, but I can hear every awful thing he's thinking about tonight. They reached the altar, and Dickie placed Celestina's hand in Manchester's before stepping back to stand beside Ruth. Manchester's hand was warm and steady around hers, and for just a moment she felt the urge to pull away from him entirely. The Reverend began to speak in the sonorous tones reserved for such occasions. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God and in the presence of these witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony, which is an honourable estate, instituted by God and signifying unto us the mystical union between Christ and his church. Celestina barely heard the words that followed. Her mind was spinning with too many things at once, her mother's face transforming before her eyes, the creature in her childhood memory, Manchester's thoughts bleeding into her own mind as though there were no barrier between them. What was happening to her? Was she going mad? Or was this what it meant to be connected to someone the way Manchester claimed they were connected? Do you, Wilbur Manchester, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part? Manchester's voice was steady and clear when he answered, I do. And do you, Celestina Grover, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part? Celestina opened her mouth to speak, but the word caught in her throat for just a moment. She looked at Manchester and at his face and at his eyes, searching for something she couldn't name, and for just the briefest instant, she saw them turn black. I do, she whispered. You may kiss the bride, the Reverend intoned. The kiss was a formality, nothing more than a fleeting touch of lips that left no warmth behind and stirred nothing in her heart. Though Celestina thought that Manchester lingered perhaps a moment longer than necessary, as though he were hoping for something more from her that she could not give. Applause echoed faintly in her ears as they turned to face the small congregation, and she realized with a sinking feeling in her stomach that it was done. She was married now, Lady Manchester. The thought made her feel ill. The ceremony ended quickly after that, with none of the usual celebration or extended well wishes. The guests filed out of the chapel in near silence, offering brief congratulations that felt hollow and perfunctory. Her father had been clear that there would be no reception, no gathering at the manor afterward. Best to keep things quiet, he had said. The less attention drawn to this, the better. As they exited the chapel into the grey afternoon light, Celestina caught sight of a group of villagers gathered near the church gate, watching them with expressions that ranged from curiosity to something darker that she couldn't quite identify. She looked away quickly and climbed into the waiting carriage. The villagers had not dispersed after the wedding party left. If anything, more had gathered, drawn by curiosity or something less benign. They clustered in small groups near the church entrance, speaking in low voices that carried an edge of anger and fear. Mrs. Fletcher stood among them, her face flushed with the importance of being the bearer of news. She had been talking for some time already, her voice growing louder with each retelling of what she had overheard at the well. "I'm telling you what I heard with my own ears," she said, her hands gesturing dramatically. "Higgins and that Gretchen girl, talking plain as day about Lady Celestina killing one of those demons. Crushed it with a stone. Cold as death itself, they said." "That's madness," someone muttered, but the protest was weak and unconvincing. Jim stood off to the side, his arms crossed over his chest, his face troubled. He had been trying to stay out of it, but the memories of that night were too vivid to ignore. The blue lights following him through the woods, the creatures chasing him, the Reverend pulling him into the church and saving him from whatever that terrible light had been. Enos emerged from his cottage, still weak but insistent on being heard. He had regained much of his strength in recent days, though his eyes still held a haunted quality that made people uncomfortable to look at him for too long. "She is a witch," he said loudly enough that the conversations around him died down. "I have no doubt of it. I saw what she did. I felt it." Higgins stood near the church steps, listening to it all with a deepening frown. He had known the Grover family his entire life, had watched Celestina grow from a small girl into a young woman. He could not reconcile the kind, gentle person he knew with the stories being told about her now. But he had also seen things he could not explain. The mutilated sheep in his fields, their bodies opened in ways that no natural predator could achieve. The strange lights in the sky, the way Innes had fallen into that death-like state for days on end. Something was happening in their hamlet, and it seemed to center around Lady Celestina. He just didn't know what to make of it yet. The church door opened, and Reverend Whitmore stepped out, his face grave as he took in the crowd that had gathered. He had hoped they would disperse peacefully, but he could see now that they were waiting for him, wanting answers he wasn't sure he could provide. "Good people," he began, but he was immediately cut off. "What do you know about them?" a farmer named Thomas called out. "About the Grovers? Why did you marry them off so quickly like that?" "The Duke wished for a small private ceremony," the Reverend said carefully. Given Lady Georgie's condition, it seemed. "Lady Georgie died and came back," Mrs. Fletcher interrupted. "We all heard about it. That's not natural, Reverend. That's witchcraft or something worse." "She was very ill," Whitmore said firmly. "She recovered. Such things happen by God's grace." "My sheep didn't recover," Higgins said quietly, and the crowd turned to look at him. His voice carried more weight than the others, and they knew it. "Something tore them apart in my fields. Not a wolf, not a dog, something I've never seen before. And it happened the same night that Enos took sick." Enos nodded vigorously. "I saw her," he said, his voice rising. "I saw Lady Celestina with those creatures. She called down lightning on me, bound me up with that blue light. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was like being held by the devil himself." "That's not what happened," Jim said suddenly, stepping forward. Everyone turned to look at him, surprised. "I saw those creatures too. They chased me through the woods. But it wasn't Lady Celestina who sent them. She wasn't there at all." "Then who was?" someone demanded. Jim hesitated, his gaze sliding to the Reverend. "I don't know what they were, but Reverend Whitmore saved me from them. He pulled me into the church and we hid until morning. He knows I'm telling the truth." All eyes turned to Whitmore, who stood very still on the church steps. He had hoped this moment would not come, that he could avoid speaking of what he had witnessed that night, but there was no escaping it now. "I saw lights," he said slowly, "strange lights that moved with purpose, and I saw—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I saw things I cannot explain, but that does not mean Lady Celestina is responsible for them." "She killed one of them," Mrs. Fletcher insisted. Gretchen and Higgins both said so. "I heard them talking," Higgins admitted reluctantly. "But I don't know what it means. I don't know if Lady Celestina is a victim in all this, or something else entirely." The crowd was growing agitated now, voices overlapping as people shared their own stories and fears. More cattle had gone missing. Strange sounds in the night. Lights in the sky that moved in ways no star or comet ever had. The door of the church banged open again, and a young farmer named William stumbled out, his face pale and his breath coming hard as though he had been running. "Reverend," he gasped, "all of you. There's something you need to see." The crowd fell silent, turning to look at him. "What is it?" Whitmore asked. "Out in Barker's Field," William said. "You have to come see it. I don't have words for it." Higgins exchanged a glance with the Reverend, and without another word they began to follow William away from the church. The rest of the crowd fell in behind them, a procession of confused and frightened people making their way across the hamlet towards the fields beyond. The walk to Barker's Field took perhaps 10 minutes, but it felt longer in the heavy silence that had fallen over the group. No one spoke. They simply followed William's hurried pace across the road and down the narrow path that led between two hedgerows toward the wheat fields that stretched out beyond the village proper. The day was grey and overcast, the kind of English afternoon where the clouds sit low and close and make everything feel muffled and subdued. There was no wind to speak of, which made what they were about to see all the more unsettling. William stopped at the edge of the field and pointed without saying a word. At first, it was hard to understand what they were looking at. The wheat had been pushed down in places, flattened against the earth in a way that seemed almost deliberate, but, from ground level, it just looked like damage, like something large had trampled through the field in the night, though there were no footprints or tracks to suggest what that something might have been. Higgins walked forward slowly, his boots crunching on the dry earth at the field's edge. He crouched down and ran his hand over the flattened stalks, feeling the way they had been bent but not broken, pressed down with a force that left them lying in neat, uniform directions. "This isn't from animals," he said quietly. The Reverend moved closer as well, his eyes scanning the patterns in the wheat. There were circular sections where the grain had been pushed down, and between them, other sections where it still stood upright. It created a strange patchwork effect that made no sense from where they stood. Mrs. Fletcher clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders. What could have done this? No one answered her. Jim walked along the edge of the pattern, trying to trace its shape with his eyes, but it was impossible to make sense of it from the ground. The circles overlapped and connected in ways that seemed almost intentional, but the purpose of it escaped him entirely. Enos stood very still, staring at the flattened wheat with an expression that was difficult to read. He looked frightened, but also strangely vindicated, as though this was proof of something he had been trying to tell them all along. Higgins straightened up and looked around, his mind working through the problem methodically. "We need to see it from above," he said, "from higher up. That's the only way we'll understand what this is." The Reverend nodded slowly. "The old oak," he said, pointing toward a massive tree that stood on a small rise perhaps 100 yards away. From the top of that, we should be able to see the whole field. Higgins was already walking toward it before anyone else could respond. He was not a young man anymore, but he climbed with the practiced ease of someone who had spent his life working the land. The Reverend followed more slowly, his robes making the ascent awkward, but he managed to pull himself up onto one of the higher branches where he could see out over the field below. The rest of the group waited on the ground, their faces turned upward, watching as the two men positioned themselves in the tree's upper reaches. For a long moment, neither Higgins nor the Reverend said anything. They simply stared. From above, the pattern was unmistakable. The flattened wheat formed perfect circles that connected to one another in a geometric arrangement that no human hand could have created in the darkness of a single night. The circles varied in size, some large and some small, and they were connected by straight lines of flattened grain that ran between them with mathematical precision. It was beautiful in a terrible sort of way. The kind of beauty that makes your stomach drop because you know you are looking at something that should not exist. Higgins felt his throat tighten as he stared at it. He had been a farmer all his life. He knew wheat. He knew fields. He knew what wind could do, what rain could do, what animals could do. This was none of those things. The Reverend crossed himself slowly, his lips moving in what might have been a prayer, though no sound came out. Below them, the crowd waited in silence, sensing from the stillness above that something profound had just been realized. Finally, Higgins climbed down, his movements slow and deliberate. When his feet touched the ground again, he looked at the faces gathered around him and saw the same question in all of their eyes. "It's a pattern," he said quietly. "Perfect circles, connected by lines, too precise to be anything but deliberate." "Who would do such a thing?" Thomas asked. "And why?" Higgins shook his head. "Not who," he said. "What?" The crowd murmured uneasily, and several people took an instinctive step back from the field's edge, as though proximity to it might somehow be dangerous. The Reverend descended more slowly, his face troubled and his hands gripping the rough bark of the tree as though he needed something solid to hold on to. When he reached the ground, he looked at the villagers gathered around him and saw the fear in their faces. Fear that was rapidly turning into something else. "We should go to the Duke," someone said. "Tell him what we've found." "The Duke won't listen," Mrs. Fletcher said bitterly. "He's too busy protecting his daughter to care about what's happening to the rest of us." "She's behind this," Ines said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "Lady Celestina. She's the one bringing these creatures here. She's the one causing all of this." "You don't know that," Jim protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Don't I?" Ines shot back. "I saw her with them. I saw what she can do. And now this." He gestured toward the field. "This appears the very day she marries. That's not coincidence." The crowd's mood was shifting. Higgins could feel it. The fear was hardening into anger, and anger needed a target. They were looking for someone to blame, and Celestina Grover was the most obvious choice. "We need to be careful," Higgins said, raising his voice to be heard. "We don't understand what's happening here. Rushing to judgment will only make things worse." But he could see in their faces that his words were falling on deaf ears. They had made up their minds or were well on their way to doing so. The Reverend stood beside him, his expression grim. "Go home," he said to the crowd. "All of you. Go home and pray. We will find answers, but not like this. Not in anger and fear." Slowly, reluctantly, the villagers began to disperse, though Higgins noticed that they kept glancing back at the field as they walked away, as though they couldn't quite believe what they had seen. When the last of them had gone, Higgins and the Reverend stood alone at the edge of the wheat field, staring at the impossible pattern that had appeared in the night. "What do we do?" Higgins asked quietly. The Reverend shook his head. "I don't know," he said, "but I fear we are running out of time to find out." Celestina stood in her bedroom, still wearing her wedding dress, staring at her reflection in the mirror without really seeing it. Her hands were trembling as she reached behind herself to try to unfasten the buttons that ran down the back of the gown, but her fingers kept slipping and she couldn't seem to make them work properly. She had sent away the maid who had offered to help her undress, unable to bear the thought of anyone looking at her right now. But now she was regretting that decision as she struggled with the buttons and felt panic rising in her chest. She was married. The reality of it was beginning to sink in now that the ceremony was over, and she was alone. She was Lady Manchester, and that meant certain expectations, certain duties that she had tried very hard not to think about until this moment. Her mother had spoken to her about such things once, years ago, in vague and uncomfortable terms that had left Celestina more confused than enlightened. Ruth had been more direct the night before the wedding, though she had couched it all in gentle reassurances that had done nothing to calm Celestina's nerves. "He cares for you," Ruth had said. "He will be gentle, and it will become easier with time." But Celestina didn't want gentle. She didn't want any of it. She barely knew this man, barely trusted him, and the thought of him touching her in the ways that husbands were entitled to touch their wives made her feel sick with dread. There was a soft knock at the door, and before she could respond, it opened. Manchester stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He had removed his coat and waistcoat, and his shirt was open at the collar in a way that made him look less formal but somehow more present, more real. Celestina took an instinctive step backward, her hands going to her throat. "I didn't say you could come in," she said, her voice sharper than she had intended. Manchester paused, his hands still on the door. "This is my room now as well," he said carefully. "We are married." "I'm aware of that," Celestina said, "but I'm not. I need time." Manchester studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. She could see him weighing something in his mind, making some kind of calculation that she couldn't follow. "Turn around," he said finally. "What?" "Your dress," he said, gesturing toward her back. "You can't unfasten it yourself? Turn around, and I'll help you." Celestina hesitated, her heart pounding. But he was right. She couldn't manage it on her own, and she couldn't very well sleep in her wedding gown. Slowly, reluctantly, she turned her back to him. She felt his fingers brush against the nape of her neck as he began working the buttons free one by one, with a practiced efficiency that suggested he had done this before for someone else. The thought made her stomach twist with something she didn't want to examine too closely. "I know you're frightened," Manchester said quietly as he worked. "I can hear your heart racing from here." "Then perhaps you should leave me alone," Celestina said, her voice tight. "I will," he said, "but not before we come to an understanding about what this marriage will be." He finished with the last button, and Celestina felt the gown loosen around her shoulders. She clutched it to her chest to keep it from falling and turned to face him again, putting several feet of distance between them. "What kind of understanding?" she asked warily. Manchester moved to the chair by the window and sat down, his posture deliberately relaxed in a way that was clearly meant to make her feel less threatened. It didn't work, but she appreciated the effort nonetheless. "I meant what I said when I agreed to marry you," he began. "I want to help you. I want to protect you from what's happening to us both. But I also understand that you don't trust me, and I'm not fool enough to think that will change overnight." "Then what do you want from me?" Celestina asked. "Nothing you're not willing to give," Manchester said. "Not tonight, not until you're ready." Celestina stared at him, searching his face for signs of deception or manipulation, but all she saw was a kind of weary resignation, as though he had been expecting this conversation and had already made peace with how it would go. "You're my husband," she said slowly. "You have certain rights. The law says so. The church says so." "The law and the church can go to hell," Manchester said bluntly, and Celestina was so startled by the profanity that she almost laughed despite herself. I'm not going to force myself on you, Celestina. Not tonight, not ever. What kind of man do you think I am? I don't know what kind of man you are, Celestina said. That's the problem. I hear your thoughts in my head, and I see you in my nightmares, and I don't know if you're trying to save me or if you're part of whatever is destroying me. Manchester stood up slowly, his movements careful and deliberate, as though he were approaching a frightened animal that might bolt at any moment. I am trying to save you, he said, whether you believe that or not, and I think part of you knows it's true, even if you're too frightened to admit it. He moved toward the door and Celestina felt a confusing mixture of relief and something else she couldn't quite identify. Where are you going? She asked. To sleep in the guest room, Manchester said. You need time and space, and I'm going to give you both. But Celestina... He paused with his hand on the door handle and turned back to look at her. This can't go on forever. Eventually, you're going to have to decide whether you're going to trust me or not, because if you don't, we're both going to be lost. I don't know how to trust you when I can't even trust my own mind, Celestina said, her voice breaking slightly. Something in Manchester's expression softened. Then we'll figure it out together, he said. One day at a time, but not tonight. Tonight you sleep, and I'll stay out of your way. He left the room and closed the door quietly behind him, and Celestina stood there in her loosened wedding gown, staring at the place where he had been and trying to understand the complicated tangle of emotions in her chest. She had expected him to be cruel, to insist on his rights as her husband, to take what the law said he was entitled to take. But he hadn't done any of those things. He had respected her fear and given her the space she needed, even though it clearly cost him something to do so. And somehow, that made everything more confusing than it had been before. Celestina finished undressing and put on her nightgown with shaking hands. She climbed into bed and pulled the covers up to her chin, staring at the ceiling in the darkness and listening to the sound of her own breathing. But sleep would not come. Her mind was too full of images and thoughts that wouldn't quiet down. Her mother's vacant face, the creature in her childhood memory, and Manchester. Always Manchester, hovering at the edges of every thought, every fear, every nightmare. After what felt like hours of lying there awake, Celestina heard a sound from the room next door. Footsteps moving slowly, and then the creak of a bed as someone lay down on it. Manchester, in the guest room, just as he had said. She listened to the sounds of him settling in, and gradually they faded into silence. And eventually, into the soft, steady breathing of sleep. Celestina lay in the darkness, listening to Manchester's breathing through the wall, and felt the weight of everything pressing down on her chest until she could barely draw breath. Her mother was dying. No, worse than dying. Her mother was already gone in every way that mattered, reduced to a breathing shell that sat in a chair and stared at nothing with vacant eyes. The woman who had raised her, who had loved her unconditionally despite all the strangeness and fear, was simply not there anymore. And soon, even that shell would stop breathing. Celestina felt tears sliding down her temples and into her hair as she stared at the ceiling. She had been holding herself together all day through the ceremony and the chaos that followed, but now, in the darkness and silence, there was nothing to distract her from the truth. Her mother was the only person in the world who had truly loved her. Ruth cared, certainly, but Ruth had her own life now, her own husband and household to manage. Ruth would return to Timothy's estate within days, and Celestina would be left here with only her father and Manchester, her father, Lord Grover. A man who had never shown her an ounce of warmth or affection that wasn't calculated for some purpose. A man who had married her off like chattel to solve a problem, who cared more about the family reputation than about her happiness or safety. A cruel man who would only grow crueler without Georgie there to temper him. And Manchester, who claimed to care for her but who she could not bring herself to trust. Manchester, with his black eyes in her nightmares and his thoughts bleeding into hers. Manchester, who was always there, always watching, always knowing too much. Manchester, whose thoughts about tonight had made her skin crawl even as he'd tried to be honourable. She would be alone with them, trapped in this house with a cruel father and a husband she feared, with no one to shield her or comfort her when the darkness came. The thought made her chest tighten with panic so intense that she had to sit up to breathe properly. She couldn't do this. She couldn't live like this. Day after day, year after year in this house with these men, watching her mother's empty shell until it finally stopped breathing. And then what? More years of this half-life, more nights of terror, more mornings of pretending everything was normal when nothing was normal and nothing had been normal since she was 7 years old. Celestina pressed her hands to her face and tried to muffle the sound of her sobbing, not wanting Manchester to hear her through the wall. But even as she wept, another thought was forming in her mind, a desperate, impossible thought that she couldn't quite push away. They had power, the creatures. Whatever they were, wherever they came from, they had power beyond anything human. She had seen it with her own eyes. They could create light from nothing. Blue light that moved with purpose and intent, that could lift people into the air or crush them where they stood. She had felt that power herself, had been caught in it, and transported in ways she still didn't fully understand. And they had brought her mother back. That was the thought that kept circling in her mind, refusing to be ignored. Georgie had been dead. Her heart had stopped. Her breathing had ceased. And Dickie had been weeping over her body. But then she had gasped and opened her eyes and started breathing again, as though death itself had been reversed. If they could do that once, couldn't they do it again? Couldn't they fix whatever was wrong with Georgie now? Couldn't they restore her to the vibrant, loving woman she had been before the stroke took her mind away? Celestina knew it was madness to even think such things. The creatures terrified her. They had haunted her dreams and stolen pieces of her memory and done things to her that she couldn't even fully remember. Asking them for help was like asking the devil for salvation. But what else could she do? The physicians had no answers. Prayer had accomplished nothing. Her mother was slipping away more each day, and soon there would be nothing left but an empty shell that barely remembered how to breathe. The creatures were the only ones with power enough to change that. They were the only ones who might be able to help. And they were listening. She knew they were listening. They were always watching, always present, even when she couldn't see them. She could feel them at the edges of her awareness, like a pressure in the air before a storm. Maybe if she went outside. Maybe if she made herself available to them. Maybe if she showed them she was willing. Celestina climbed out of bed slowly, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. She pulled her dressing gown around herself and moved to the window, looking out at the darkness beyond. The grounds of the manor stretched out before her, shadowy and indistinct in the faint moonlight that filtered through the clouds. And somewhere out there, in the fields and the woods and the darkness, they were watching. They were always watching. She opened the window carefully, wincing at the small creak it made. She listened for any sound from Manchester's room, but there was nothing. He was still asleep. Good. She climbed out onto the ledge and then down the trellis that ran along the side of the house, her hands gripping the wooden slats with a strength born of desperation. She had climbed this way before, years ago, when she was younger and more reckless. The trellis held her weight now just as it had then. When her feet touched the ground, she stood very still for a moment, listening to the silence of the night. Then she began to walk, her bare feet silent on the grass as she moved away from the manor. She didn't know where she was going. She had no destination in mind, no plan beyond getting away from the house and into the open where they might see her, where they might find her, where they might take her. The thought should have terrified her, but instead she felt only a strange calm settling over her as she walked. This was what she had to do. This was the only option left. If they would take her, maybe they would listen. Maybe they would understand. Maybe they would help her mother the way they had helped before. And if they didn't, well, at least she wouldn't have to wake up tomorrow morning in that house with those men and that dying woman and no hope left at all. The walk seemed both endless and far too short. She crossed the grounds and then the road, her dressing gown catching on brambles and her feet growing cold and dirty from the damp earth. But she didn't stop, couldn't stop. She walked until she found herself in the fields beyond the village, the darkness pressing close around her and the stars cold and distant overhead. The wheat was tall here, the stalks rustling softly around her as she pushed through them. And then, quite suddenly, the wheat parted. There was a circle of pressed and flattened stalks before her, the grain lying in neat spirals against the earth. She stared at it for a moment, not understanding what she was seeing, only knowing that it felt somehow deliberate, intentional. She moved to the middle of the circle and looked up at the sky. The clouds had parted slightly, revealing a scatter of stars that seemed impossibly distant and cold. "Please," she whispered to the darkness and the stars and whatever might be listening. "I know you're there. I know you can hear me. Please help her. Please fix what's wrong. I'll do anything, anything you want. Just please don't let her die like this." The field was silent around her. The wheat rustled softly in a breeze she couldn't feel, and somewhere in the distance an owl called out in the darkness. Celestina stood there for a long moment, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The cold seeped into her bones. Her feet were numb now, and she was beginning to shiver in her thin dressing gown. But still she waited. Still she hoped. Please, she thought, please see me, please take me, please help. To be continued.